Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today for this, which we expect to be the first of what we expect to be an annual meeting of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative. And, what I'm going to do this morning is I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I do want to do two things to start with. I do want to recognize and express appreciation to certain individuals who helped make this happen. I mean, we put this together in record time. We put this together pretty quickly, and certainly want to thank you and your staffs for your cooperation in helping us do that. And I also want to address, some of the things on the agenda, and then any questions that somebody may have, right from the start that you need to have dealt with. But first of all, the meeting, as I said, was put together in record time. From the moment the decision was made to have our first gathering back in June, lots of people went to work immediately to make it happen. So I'd like to thank Otis Williams, who you met, with the St. Louis Development Corporation, which is the City of St. Louis's development arm, and Amy Lampy, who is the young lady you saw out front with the name tags. Both of them worked feverishly to help with the organization of this and to get this thing off the ground. So I want to thank you, Otis, and certainly want to thank Amy as well for that. We also have with us Julie Zeno of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Kelly Kauser and Ashley Machin with Hyatt for their efforts. I want to thank them for their efforts to make this meeting happen. All of these people have been giving their time to make sure that this initiative and this first meeting particularly is a success. We want to give special recognition to Moria McDonald of the Walton Family Foundation, the main sponsor of this effort and this meeting today. I especially want to thank my fellow mayors, and again, all you, and your staffs for the time and dedication to bringing your voice to this very, very important initiative. The Mississippi River, trying to do what we can to preserve the Mississippi River, and as I talked about last night, to basically get a better understanding of the challenges and the opportunities for our communities relative to the river, and how we together can work on being the most effective in addressing those things. It will definitely take mayors to lead this effort. We are on the front lines. We're on the ground. We see what's happening. If there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's a problem with moving goods and commodities up and down the river, if there's an issue with pollution, regardless of whatever agency might otherwise be involved, and there are many in each one of those situations, mayors are, their constituents, the people we represent, the communities that we serve, want to know what the mayors are doing, and certainly as mayors, we're concerned on what we can do to help address the situation in a way that will be responsible, not just to the people we represent today, but to future generations as well. So without us, without the leadership that we can provide, I'm not sure this could be an effective or successful initiative. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us here today. More than 40 mayors have joined the MRCTI, and over 20 of them have come here this week for this meeting. Collectively, over 1.5 million people are represented by those mayors who are seated around this table, and that just includes the central cities. That doesn't include the communities around the cities. Looking over the agenda for the next day and a half, there are a few items I'd like to bring to your attention. First of all, regarding the press conference, everyone is invited to attend. That will be at 11:30 this morning. Everybody's invited to attend. The mayors will be signing a pledge for the Mississippi River as a symbol of our commitment to this effort, as well as a way to solidify our initiative. We will be in the Park View room on the 4th floor, again at 11:30 this morning. We'd like all the mayors to gather behind the podium in that room shortly before we begin, to make sure that everyone is in position, and we certainly hope that mayors will find all the work sessions valuable. But if mayors could be there at 4 o'clock, and anybody, I guess, else that wants to be there, be here at 4 o'clock p.m. today, and 11 o'clock tomorrow, we will be deciding the leadership of the future of this initiative. We will have, we select initially an executive committee. We hope to have around 10 on there, and 2 co-chairs. So anybody interested in doing that, being part of that, could talk with Colin here. A reminder about this evening, we will be meeting in the lobby of this hotel at 5:45 p.m. to walk over together to our evening showcase, which is about a block and a half from here. The showcase will feature a presentation and a sit-down dinner. As you know, we'll be seating a temporary 10-member executive committee this afternoon and 2 co-chairs. There will be a mayor from each of the 10 states touched by the Mississippi, and a chair from a city above 100,000 and a chair from a city below 100,000 in population. The temporary executive committee will hold their seats until next summer, when bylaws can be adopted and full term of leaders can be elected. If you are interested in representing your state on this committee, again, or being a co-chair, please inform Colin Wellenkamp, who is sitting right next to me. If there's any questions before we begin and get on with the program at all? Okay, at this time, I'd like to hand the meeting over to Hyram Copeland, the mayor of Vidalia, Louisiana, to moderate our first topic of discussion. Mayor?
Thank you, Mayor Slade. First of all, I want to congratulate you on your beautiful city. Had an opportunity to ride around last night and look at it. I know you're very proud of it. As I said to you earlier, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Everywhere we'd stop, tour guides say, well, this is free, that's free, this is free. And he said this is the second largest city in the United States that offers so many things free. So congratulations on your beautiful city.
Thank you. Washington, D.C. is number 1, we know. Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate the remarks.
Thank you, Mayor Slade. Good morning, everyone. I will be moderating our first session today on floods and droughts, mitigating, insuring, and developing in their path. As mayors along America's great river, we all have to deal with flooding and most recently drought. But this panel was of specific interest to me due to the devastating floods that hit Vidalia this past year. And if I may elaborate on that a little bit, we across the river from historic Natchez, Mississippi, we were faced with a devastating flood last year. If you can imagine being a small town mayor and Corps of Engineers and start telling you how high the river's going to be. At first it was a particular height, which we had no problem with. Then it started going up and up and up. And of course we hit a record year, 500-year flood. We had a riverfront development project, $75 million, hundreds of jobs that was in danger of losing that project. Mayor from Vicksburg, what we're talking about, he had something similar to that. But it was unbelievable. All of a sudden you're looking at a devastating 500-year flood. You ask yourself, what are you going to do? And what can you do on a 500-year flood? But we were blessed with the aspect, and if anyone has not heard of ESCO baskets, I go to bed every night thanking the good Lord ESCO baskets came to our community. We started implementing them about 3.5 days before the water actually started coming over our riverfront in Vidalia. And in 3.5 days, we implemented the ESCO baskets around our businesses. We had 2 large medical facilities, a hotel, a convention conference center, that we put those baskets around. And unbelievable, we saved each and every one. Not one drop of water got in those buildings. And then, after fighting that, we had a record drought, the worst that we've had in 70 years. What kind of a financial impact it did on Vidalia is we have a hydroelectric plant, and from operating at 100% the year before, we're operating at 20%. It had an economic devastating effect on our community of between $4 and $6 million. We're a small community, so you can imagine $4 to $6 million out of your general fund just in a matter of 14 to 15 months. I made the comment, we've had a record flood last year, a drought this year. We've also had 2 hurricanes. A hurricane that actually bypasses about 20 miles, thank the good Lord, we were saved there. As I was coming up and going through the southeastern part of Missouri, I seen where it said New Madrid, Missouri, and I think that's where the New Madrid fault starts. And I said to myself, well, all we like now is having a earthquake this coming year. But I hope that does not occur and have that plague. But we were very fortunate. Everyone joined together. That's what blessed our community. As Mayor, I see him shaking his head. He knows what I'm talking about. You find out what you're made out of when you have something like that. This is my 9th term in office, and in all those years, I never had anything of that magnitude. I have had a freeze before that shut us off without electricity for 3.5 days. But we weathered that, and we'll weather hopefully the next one. We've gained a lot of experience by that. But I know that each and every one of y'all have a story that's probably as similar to what we had as far as today is concerned. But I'm glad we're having this meeting. I think it's going to be very informative and help us in many ways. Therefore, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Sandra Knight, the Deputy Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administrator for Mitigation at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Chad Berginnis, Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and Jasper Grant, Acting Missouri Executive Director of the Farm Service Agency at the United States Department of Agriculture. And thank you for all being here. Each of you will have about 20 minutes for your presentation. Then we'll move into question and answer session. Dr. Knight, you're first.
Okay. Well, good morning. I am really glad to be here. Thank you, Colin, for inviting me, and Mayor Slade for hosting this. I will start by saying that the Mississippi River is in my blood. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, grew up, went to college at Memphis State, and then went to work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and so lived in Vicksburg for many years. And in my career with the Corps, I got to work on projects all along the Mississippi River. In particular, I worked on the Upper Mississippi River Navigation Study for many years. So I'm familiar with a lot of your towns. I've probably stayed in them. We used to have our meetings all along the river. And I had the great fortune after my career with the Corps to go work for NOAA at NOAA's headquarters. So I learned a little bit about weather and the climate. And now I'm at FEMA, and as Mayor Copeland said, I manage the mapping and mitigation programs for that are connected not only to the Stafford Act but the flood insurance program. So I want to. You brought up an interesting point about 2011 and this year, the droughts. But in 2011, there were $14 billion disasters in this country. And so FEMA was busy, but most importantly, the communities and the local communities and states that had to deal with that were really busy. And it is everything from floods to tornadoes to hurricanes to earthquakes. And so what my message today, I hope, is because you, as Mayor Hartwell said, if you want to get something done, you ask the mayors to do it. It's up to you to help your communities be disaster resilient. And I hope I connect that to the bottom line here and how that makes your community more economically resilient too. I even go back further in terms of my roots, and I'll start by telling a story. My father's family lived in eastern Arkansas on behind the levees, which weren't very good levees at the time. That was during the Depression, late 20s, after the 27 flood. Eking a living off the land, as many people did in those days. And he tells a story about when he was a young boy that they knew when the water was coming up that they had to do something. So they were perfectly aware they were at risk. They didn't have the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project to protect them. And his job, when that happened, was to grab his baby twin sisters, which were about 8 or 9 years younger than him, and put one on each hip and take them to the top of the levee they had there and take them out of harm's way. While the rest of his family, I'm sure his parents, were packing up the few belongings they had and taking action in that regard. Fast forward, 2011. My brother and his family, I'm going to poke a little fun at my brother, but it represents, I think, a state of mind that we all have kind of now in this society, that perhaps we've gotten a little soft, perhaps we're not as resilient. But 2011, my brother lives in the Memphis area. And Mayor Wharton, you may recall that not only was the Mississippi coming up, but the Wolf River came up. and he lives out in Cordova, and he lives about a half a mile from the Wolf River. And I know a couple years ago we had this discussion, particularly after I got involved with the flood insurance program. Well, brother, do you have flood insurance? You're only a half a mile from the river. Well, my real estate agent told me I'm not in the 100-year floodplain, so I don't need it. I said, but you're awful close, and it'd be pretty cheap outside of the 100-year flood zone to get flood protection. Okay, so 2011, he calls me. Sandra, what I do? The water's coming out. It's out of the banks. It's over the road. They're shutting things down. I said, well, you have flood insurance, don't you? No, he didn't. So I said, well, the best thing you can do is get all that stuff out of your garage, put some sandbags around your door, and get out of there, you know. So, and then a few hours later, he calls me back. Well, FEMA has a program, don't they? Don't they just give you some money? I said, well, there are a lot of things have to happen before that happens, but in the event that you actually did qualify for something, the average payout on an individual assistance is about $3,000 or $4,000. Think that'll cover it? So I haven't asked again. I don't want to have to say I told you so, so I don't know if he got the insurance or not, but, you know, that's passed. But it turns out it wasn't so expensive. It really wasn't. If you're not in the special flood hazard area, it can be, you know, $150 to $400, you know. That's probably far less than what he spends on a weekend trip to a football game at Ole Miss, right? So anyway, I just want to put that in perspective because it tells something to me about our society today and something that we found as part of our flood mapping program is that we really need to communicate risk. We realized when we were updating our flood maps, which actually lay out all the flood risks for the whole nation, and help set those rates for the insurance program, that we're engineers building maps. We'd toss them over the fence, if you will, and expect people to understand them. Well, what we found out is we really needed to do a little more communicating. So our next generation maps we call risk map, mapping, assessment, and planning. And it involves a lot of outreach. So as part of that outreach, we said, well, we don't even know how to outreach, so let's see what people know. So we did a survey. This is where you come in. So we did a survey, phone calls, questionnaire, sent it out to local officials like yourself, sent it out to citizens, and so here's some of the results. Very good to you guys. 68% of you that were surveyed said you knew that your communities were at flood risk. That's pretty good. The citizens that were interviewed, only 41% knew that their communities were at flood risk, and only 12% of the citizens believed that their own home was in flood risk. So that may be the case. Maybe they're not, you know, maybe their communities, their house isn't. But I think it brings out some points of, so how do we communicate? How do we get this message out? And so some of the things we learned were that to raise awareness of flood risk, they really wanted to hear it from you. They wanted to hear it from their local constituents, from the local papers, and they wanted some push tactics, you know, whether it's the local news or phone call. They actually liked phone calls and the radio, too. So, you know, all things aren't new technology. And they also drew upon their experiences, like the experiences you just talked about. So I challenge you to help your communities understand the risk and make sure you talk to them about it. Because the first thing to buy down risk is to understand what the risk is, know what you can do. We've started a campaign. I loved taking people in Vicksburg down to the waterfront. And I love to take them down there because on the flood wall down there is some marks.
Yes.
And it shows the 1927 flood, the 1973 flood, et cetera, et cetera. It's a reminder that that river is out there and just how powerful and mighty it is. And we're trying to implement a campaign, and you can do this in your own community, that you know what your line is, know your line, be flood aware. Put up some signs, remind people of the historical events that occurred in your community. It isn't a deterrent, it's a reminder. You can then talk about the flood protection measures you've put in place to buy that risk down. But it's a reminder to all of us of what your flood risk is. So let me give you some news you can use in addition to communicating risk. You're probably under a lot of pressure. You want to grow your citizens. You want to grow your tax base. Developers want to come in and they want to do it cheap and fast. They want to make some money. You want to get some things going. But I implore you to think about the long haul. And I implore you to realize that being sustainable means being disaster resilient, because you know what it costs. Those of you, how many of you had disasters this year, flooding in 2011? A lot. Maybe all weren't presidentially declared, but you had flooding. You know how much it costs to get a community back on its feet. So if you don't have to go through that process, you're going to save some money. But here's some other things you can do for the bottom line. So I'm going to start out with another story. Are you familiar with Valmeyer, Illinois? So after the 93 floods, they moved. So they had flooding in 1910, 1943, 1944. I think they dodged a bullet from 73 based on some levees. But in 1993, the village was 90% devastated. And they made a conscious decision and had the courage and political will to decide to move. Now, they had a place to move, so this isn't viable for all. So you can't just transport St. Louis up on the bluff here. But this was a small town, and they had 900 citizens at that time. And so they took, and this isn't just a federal action, they took their own private funds, their own public funds. They combined them with some of FEMA's hazard mitigation grant funds. We bought out 200 homes there. And they moved the community. In 1994, the first businesses were open, and homeowners started to move into their new village in 1995. The number of people in the Valmeyer has grown from 900 to the 2006 census said 1,200. So do the calculations. You got more citizens, you got more tax bases. It's good for the bottom line. They also chose to work on some incentives to put high energy efficient homes in place. And you see this in a lot of disaster can be an opportunity. So it's an opportunity to build back right. So here's an opportunity for the citizens to take advantage of high energy efficient homes and save money for themselves as well as save the planet. So there are things you can do that really affect the bottom line. So it also has to do, and this is where it takes a lot of political will on your part, and this is not a federal, anything the federal government can do about this. You own zoning, land use, and building codes. And those are the measures, the long haul measures, that at the end of the day will pay off in disaster resilience. And it's not going to be instantaneous. You're not going to get instant gratification from that, but it is the long haul. And there are incentive programs, I think, that help us do that. So I was asked to talk about the flood insurance program a little bit. So you're aware that the National Flood Insurance Program is a condition of being belonging as a community to the program. You have to put some flood ordinances in place. Well, those are deemed to be kind of the minimum standard ordinances that we expect. By doing this, then your citizens are afforded affordable insurance and the things that come with that. But we have an incentive program called the Community Rating System. Are any of you members of the Community Rating System program? This is something you can do. So the Community Rating System, out of the 21,000 communities that are in the National Flood Insurance Program, about 1,900 have entered our Community Rating System. What that is an incentive program that you have this whole smorgasbord of activities you can do in your community that you get credit for. And if you get a certain amount of points, then your insurance for all of your constituents is reduced.
We did it.
You're a member, yeah, that's coming to, okay. So, and if you're class 1 is the best, down to class 9. Well, class 1, I'm going to tell you, it's hard work. We only have one community in the United States that's Class 1, and that's Roseville, California. But we have several number 2s and number 3s that are trying harder, you know. So what it does for the number 1 community, the maximum discount is up to 45% of your premium. That's a big deal. But that's not the only bottom line. It's not just to the folks paying those premiums. We had a study conducted by Texas A&M, and what they're finding is many of the measures that we identified as things that would that communities could do under the community rating system were good for the bottom line for the community, regardless of the premium. So the two big things that really paid off the most were free board and open space. And so by free board, what I'm talking about is the things that are in the flood zone or above the flood zone. And the further above it, the better the payoff. Open space is open space, and I'm going to talk to that again in a minute on another front. But what they found, Texas A&M study sampled 450 communities and looked at 11 years of flood claims data. Those communities with free board showed an average of $960,000 worth of fewer flood claims each year. If all the communities in the study sample maximize their freeboard credit by adopting 3 feet of freeboard into their local ordinance, the total average savings per community would be approximately $3 million worth of annual reduced losses. Those are big numbers. So that's one example of some of the things that are ideas that are in the community rating system. Some of them are more environmentally focused, like low-impact development, but we know that that affects the bottom line, too, in terms of how you manage your flood risk. So the next effort, when we talk about some things we do and what's good for the bottom line. Many of you may be aware, or maybe you're not, but the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that's linked to the Stafford Act. So if there's a presidentially declared disaster in your state, whatever money is spent towards that disaster, 15% of it is set aside and given back to the state for projects that are eligible for hazard mitigation. Now, the state manages that program, and we manage the eligibility requirements. And so some of those so they go to things in the flood world. They go to things like elevations or small flood control projects. We don't compete with the Corps on big projects, but small things. They buy out homes. There's a lot of things they do. But the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program tied with the Stafford Act is all hazards. So it can go for safe rooms post-tornado, it can, or hurricane shelters, a lot of different things. So keep your eyes on that. And there's a way to get more of that if you have good mitigation plans. And I'll speak to that in a minute, too. But I just want to bring up a study. I challenged our team, and it's been a conversation among many of the federal agencies, is how do we get how do we take credit for environmental benefits? People keep saying, well, you can't value it. What is an ecosystem worth? You know, how do you put a dollar figure on it? Well, some very smart people have been working on this all over the country in a lot of different studies, but I wanted to know how it would affect our grant program. So our BCAs have strictly been on economic benefits, you know, due to losses avoided from flooding. What are some other benefits? We found out that, particularly regarding flood measures, that open space, and particularly the open space associated with riparian habitat, was really valuable. So it's on the order of $7,800 per acre per year for open space is the value. And these are probably conservative numbers, and they're average, you know, for across the nation. And the other number that's popping out is about $37,000 per year per acre on riparian habitat. So it is good for the bottom line. So if you think not preserving the environment is costing you money, it's actually a way to save you money in terms of flood costs. So building codes, I mentioned that earlier. This is where you really can step in. Mississippi, I'm proud to say, has adopted the ICC minimum standards for the state, but it doesn't stop at the state, right? Local jurisdictions have to adopt the codes too, and you can kick them up a notch. You can do more than the minimum, and that really can pay off in the long run. You mentioned the New Madrid fault. I imagine most of y'all are pretty close to it. And if you did anybody participate in the national level exercise for the New Madrid earthquake last year in your communities? So this is a big fault, and the scary thing about earthquakes is they're no notice, and if you're not prepared and you don't have the right built infrastructure, they're catastrophic. And if you have a lot of, and go back and ask some of your building officials, if you have a lot of unreinforced concrete masonry structures in your city and you do not have earthquake code, you are very vulnerable. The difference in code has been proven over and over. If you remember the Chilean earthquake last year, it was a much larger earthquake than the one in Haiti, but the damages were not nearly as severe. They had a very severe earthquake in the 70s and put code in place. So by the time this one hit, they were prepared. So if you don't have earthquake building codes and you live in the New Madrid high-risk area, I strongly encourage you to go back and have the will to put that in place, because that will shut down your city. Look at the earthquakes that are happening in California and what devastation it can happen. So that's my lecture on building codes, but I want to say again, it's good for the bottom line, and it can save lives. I want to mention too, while we're talking about all hazards and these grants, I want to talk about tornadoes. Are y'all subject to tornadoes?
Yes.
2011, did any of them hit? I mean, we had Joplin, Missouri, but we had them all over, right? I'm going to tell a story about Alabama. 60 tornadoes touched down in Alabama, all across the state. And the most compelling story I heard, post those disasters, we had a conference in Tuscaloosa, and we brought in all the local officials that had been hit by this. The town of Phil Campbell, Alabama, population 1,100, local mayor part-time, they lost 27 people, 27 lives. Now, I talked to some of you last night. You're from small communities. I lived in Vicksburg for 25 years. Losing one person, people know. 27 out of 1,100 people lost their lives. That mayor stood up and said he was going to build back stronger. And the state of Alabama has really pushed out now on putting safe rooms in place. And so the bottom line on hazard resilience isn't just about money, it's about lives. And they've taken a lot of our grant money and put it not only in private safe room structures in homes, but into public safe room shelters. But I can tell you this, that the cost, this kind of goes back to my brother not buying flood insurance, and it was pretty cheap. The cost of a safe room in a private residence is like $3,000 to $5,000. You know, how many people remodeled their kitchen, buy a four-wheeler, you know, about the same cost. So the importance of families being safe, if you can communicate that and if you can help support that, I think it's really important. Then I've got one more point, and then I'll stop. I started to mention mitigation planning. I hope you're familiar that in order to get some of this hazard mitigation grant funds, you have to have a mitigation plan in place. So the states have a requirement, and then local communities have a requirement. And some are done jurisdiction by jurisdiction, some are done regionally, but you have to have a mitigation plan in place. Well, I implore you here that this shouldn't be a document that you write and that you put on the shelf. and you dust off to show somebody so you get your grant money. It should be something that helps you plan for what could happen. It helps you imagine the impossible. It helps you plan for the probable. And I can tell you the communities that have successfully used their plans are ready when disaster hits. I mean, we had $14 billion disasters. Did I mention that? It can happen anywhere. You're subject to a lot of disasters. But this mitigation planning process helps you go through with your community all the risks that you're subjected to and think forward. Think about what you can do now to buy down that risk and what you can do in the future, because sometimes there are some, like I said, it can be an opportunity. Sometimes federal dollars, state dollars come in post-disaster. If you're ready for it, you can prepare for a more sustainable community. This year, or after Hurricane Irene last year, and Tropical Storm Lee, New Jersey was ready. And what normally can take a year or 2 years, because a lot of times our grant program is kind of after everybody's cleaned up the recovery and used the public assistance and the individual assistance, then they think about the hazard mitigation grants. But New Jersey was ready, and they were ready to use their plan, work with the state, work with the FEMA region office, and they had hazard mitigation projects in place and ready to go within a few months. And so they did it so well that other communities around the country were asking what kind of deal we gave New Jersey, that they got it done so well. But they were ready. They knew what they wanted, and they were ready to work with their counterparts at the state and FEMA. So I implore you to take that plan, make it a living part of your organization, and think about it as a way to think about the future and how let it help you with your community development planning. Let it help you with your economic development planning, because the bottom line is that a disaster-resilient community is not only sustainable but economically prosperous. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knight. That's very valuable information on the National Flood Insurance Program. I'd like to say that I want to compliment FEMA for working extremely close with Vidalia during our issues that we had, and they did a tremendous job, and I want to thank them personally for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Now I would like to recognize Mr. Berginnis for his presentation on floodplain management.
Okay.
All right, I have a one-page handout that's going around the table, and if you'll take one, and then the extras, I think I made about 50 of them total, so I think hopefully everybody can have one. Good morning. Again, my name is Chad Berginnis, and I am the Executive Director of ASFPM. We are a national nonprofit organization based out of Madison, Wisconsin, whose two-part mission is really to reduce the misery from flooding, reduce losses, reduce risk and suffering, and also looking to protect, preserve, and enhance the natural functions of floodplains. They've been around for millions of years, and they do have some very valuable natural functions. And quite frankly, I would suspect, I know that all of you around this table have an individual in your community that is a designated floodplain manager. Chances are they are probably a member of our organization. We have 14,000 members nationally. We have 34 state chapters. And we are focused really on trying to solve flood problems because our membership are the folks that are implementing floodplain management every single day. We work to develop tools, training, outreach, good policies, and those kinds of things to achieve that particular mission. One of the stories I actually have, and Mayor Thompson from Grafton there, I spent a lot of my professional life in Ohio, and at least the Mississippi River connection is about 2/3 of the flow of the Mississippi at its confluence in Cairo comes from the Ohio River. And when I was looking at my hotel room this morning, you take away the arch and some of the landmarks, and you could be in almost any city on the Ohio River in Ohio, and very similar rivers and characteristics and things. But we are in, Ohio's in FEMA Region 5, and I remember after the '93 flood, we had one of our regional meetings in Grafton. At the time, and it was Mayor Wendy, and I can't remember. Wendy Nairn, yes.
Call him Wendy for a reason. Oh, he's the father of Grafton.
Yeah, and Mayor Wendy hosted us, and Grafton was devastated. I mean, of course, in Grafton you have a deep floodplain on the Mississippi, 20 to 30 feet depth of water above the ground elevation. And Grafton chose a bold and different path, as Sandra had talked about with Valmeyer. We have Grafton. I see also Alton here at the table. And these are communities that actually ASFPM has profiled in some of our mitigation success stories, where certainly in Grafton, a large part of the community moved to the bluff and moved out of harm's way and still retained the riverfront and those things. So unfortunately, I came in from a meeting in Washington late last night, so I haven't had a chance to talk, but I'm very interested in talking about how things are still going in Grafton. But certainly as mayors, you have a lot of responsibility, a lot of decision making, and quite frankly, you're going to catch a lot of the flack. I was also a county planner in Ohio, and my first weekend on the job, we had a flood disaster in the county, southeast part of the county. We had a village of 1,000 people that 80% of the houses were flooded. And so working with the mayor over the next couple years, we developed a mitigation project, strengthened codes, and did some of those things. And this was Appalachian foothill area of Ohio, where things like codes and zoning, zoning is one of those four-letter words in some of those areas. And but again, even making small communities more resilient. But the bottom line is that, and who we call the grandfather of floodplain management, Gilbert White, way back in 1945, had a very interesting quote. He said, floods are an act of God, but flood losses are largely an act of man. And regardless of how our communities have developed through the years, that's a reality that all of you, it's a challenge that all of you get to face every single day as mayors in river communities. And so I want to talk a few things. First, I want to talk about some trends as we see it in floodplain management and flooding issues. Talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities at different levels of government. And then talk about some of the different approaches, and in some of these, I think probably reinforcing some of the things that Sandra had said. The first trend is that flood damages are increasing. In the country, what we've seen is that in the 1990s, we averaged about $5.6 billion in flood damage per year nationally. In the 2000s, that jumped to $10 billion a year. The first couple years of this decade are consistent with that trend. As Sandra mentioned, in 2011, all of those $1 billion events, 4 of those were flooding events. 4 of those $1 billion events. Prior to 1990, we really didn't have billion-dollar flood events. And so we're having those not only occasionally, we're having those multiple times a year. We also have some demographic trends. One of the things that ASFPM does is we hold a kind of we have a foundation, and we have a forum every year in Washington, D.C., where we bring in lots of experts and thinkers, and we talk about different issues. And one of those forums a few years ago, we had a gentleman from a university, from Arthur Nelson from the Virginia Tech, talk about demographics. And here's some of the interesting things. So by 2050, we're probably looking at about 460 million people in the United States. We're looking at 200 million housing units. That's up from 116 million in 2000. So between replacement and new units, though, one of the things that he said about that is that 90% of the units in 2050 will not have existed in 2000. A lot of development. Non-residential, that's even a bigger trend. By 2050, replacement and new space, 225% increase in new and replacement non-residential space. And here's one of the other things. You know, we all deal with 30-year mortgages, things like that. But you know, what's the average lifespan of a residential home, a house? You know, where the voters live. Average lifespan of a home is 150 years. And the point is, as Sandra was talking about land use and some of those kinds of things, land use decisions that are made today are going to reverberate in your communities for many, many years, many generations, quite frankly. And so those are some of the demographic trends. Oh, and by the way, and you all know this, people love living near water. A lot of people, and we've certainly seen this, especially when you're talking out migration from big cities. I actually lived in a city, a commuter city outside of Columbus, Ohio. And you had folks coming out from Columbus into the county, and they thought the best place to put their house was right next to that nice little stream that, you know, on a sunny day is just pleasant and everything, and didn't really understand the concepts of flood risk. And so we have, you know, we have a risk awareness issue, and again, something that Sandra has said. One of the other trends is our climate is changing. As mayors, you understand this. I find it kind of interesting. We do a lot of policy work in D.C., and I think D.C. is a little bit stuck in the past. They're still trying to debate who's causing it. From our standpoint, I really don't care. It's happening, and we've got to figure out how to deal with it. And 2011, the U.S. Conference of Mayors had a survey on climate change adaptation. 396 mayors from 50 states answering these questions. 31% of communities are already incorporating climate change adaptation into their fiscal planning. 40% don't, and 29% weren't sure. The cities in the Midwest were least likely to be doing this. Whereas in the Northeast and the West, they were more likely to do this. But even so, you know, we have representation here from Iowa, and even the state of Iowa in 2011 had a climate change report talking about climate change impacts in Iowa. And one of the things on climate change that I think is important from a flood standpoint is that the science has really gotten a lot better over the last few years. And where we had these big global climate models that said, you know, okay, well, we kind of expect this somewhere in the U.S., we're able to what's called downscale those data and actually get information at more of a regional level that we can help make decisions with. There are several agencies, the USGS right now, and the Corps of Engineers actually has an active climate change research program going on. And I think not too far in the distant future, we'll be able to have the information so we can build it into the calculations we look at for looking at flood levels. You know, if you're going to have more extreme and intense events, then that's going to change the hydrology and the flooding inputs in terms of what's going to happen in communities. And we at least want to be aware of that. So climate change is something that is being dealt with. In fact, there's something I watched on PBS a couple back this spring, an interview with Mayor Frame from Norfolk, Virginia. And while a lot of people look at and think about some of the real issues facing New Orleans in terms of sea level rise and subsidence, in fact, one of the places that is probably facing it as much or more is Norfolk. They have the combination of the land is sinking, and in that part of the U.S., the sea level rise is happening a lot faster. And Mayor Frame is one of the first folks that I think has publicly said, you know, we're going to approach a time we're going to have to abandon parts of our city. The interview talked about there's a road that they replaced only a few years ago, and it's already flooding a couple times a year during high tide. They tried to raise the level about 3 feet, and it's still flooding. They are facing it. They're facing it now, and they're having to adapt. And he was talking about the budgetary impacts on the city's budget, and talking about how, you know, how from a mayor's standpoint, he knows his citizens aren't ready to hear that message yet. But the fact is that probably some parts of the community are going to need to return to open space. One of the other trends, and we're starting to see this pop up in a lot of the national policy and things, and that is the federal government debt. And this is going to be something I'll hit on through the rest of my presentation. But what we're seeing is that the debt is driving some of the policy decisions. You know, for example, I think the debt combined with right now the position of no earmarks in the U.S. House has the Corps of Engineers doing some real deep soul searching in terms of future functions and missions and things like that. You know, because no earmarking means no new construction projects and starts and those kinds of things. Oh, and by the way, because our infrastructure is aging, the cost of O&M is going up like this at a time where there's no money for new starts. And so as an agency, the Corps is really evaluating how they're going to kind of face this new, and at least you know, listening to the political discourse at the federal level, I don't see it changing a whole much very soon, because we have, again, that debt that's kind of looming out there. Well, it's also the debt that's driven some of the changes in the flood insurance program. There was a flood reform bill that passed this summer that is going to impact communities across the country. And I was chair of ASFPM as a volunteer in 2004 when the last reform bill, and we were talking about moving subsidized flood insurance rates to more actuarial based on their risk. And you almost could get laughed out of the room by the members of Congress. They didn't want to hear it. 8 short years later, and $17 billion of debt that the NFIP has, that attitude has changed 180 degrees. And the reform bill is going to have a significant impact. It will change that it's going to largely eliminate a lot of these subsidized rates. And so older river communities, older coastal communities are the ones that are going to feel the impact of that the most. So I say that because as mayors, you probably want to start thinking now in terms of how we're going to deal with that. I have one of the potential solutions, and Sandra talked about it, is that there are some mitigation programs that I think can help deal with that. But you're going to have folks that have subsidized policies that they're going to be starting to be hit with 25% rate increases a year to get them to actuarial. You're going to hear about it. So be aware of that. As ASFPM, we're trying to help figure out how we can soften that impact, but also make communities more resilient all at the same time. So those are a few of the trends. Now, I also want to talk about some of the policies and some of the policies that contribute to risk and dealing with flooding. The first of those is this 100-year standard. Now, again, I've worked with the NFIP a lot in my career. I think it's a great program from the standpoint you have insurance. It's sometimes in a lot of communities, it's the only development standards that communities have. The one issue I think there is this 100-year standard has now transformed into our national default standard. I was reading a report on the plane last night from the National Academies on levee and dam safety. It used to be where levees were built to something called the standard project flood, something equivalent to about a 300-year, 500-year flood. And the concept was, well, you know what? We have a levee. There's a lot of stuff behind it, so we got to make sure it's protected and things are protected. Since we've had the NFIP and the fact that you have a 100-year standard tied to that, our default national standard on levees is 100-year. I mean, it really is. It's had the effect, and the National Academy's report talks about this, it's had the effect of reducing the safety standard on our levee systems across the country. One of the other things that we're going to have to deal with is the emphasis on structural approaches. Now, I know there's a lot of communities here that have levees and are dealing with levees. But again, the math is pretty easy. We have a heck of a lot of inventory of aging infrastructure We have no money to deal with it. And so there are going to have to be some hard choices, I think, made in the upcoming years in terms of how we maintain, how we fund, how we deal with that particular infrastructure. And then disaster relief. Disaster relief is an excellent and wonderful thing. There are many, many families that have suffered flooding that thank goodness for our disaster relief programs. But it does drive, unfortunately, one behavior, and that is folks thinking that, you know what, somebody will come in and take care of me so I can continue to make risky decisions. And and I know that's something that gives all of you probably a lot of fits, because it makes it harder to do things like being more resilient. So in terms of one of the other things that, and it's one of the conclusions I have on the paper as well, is that we have to come to a point where we're realizing that these complex flood problems have to be solved by multiple solutions. And one of the things, there was a debate on the reform bill this summer. In the Senate, there was a very interesting debate going on, and in fact, there were some other nonprofit interest organizations that were on the other side of ASFPM on this issue, but was a concept called residual risk. If you think of risk as kind of a stair-step fashion, you tend to buy down risk with the different things that you do. But the point is, there's always a stair below. There's still risk remaining. I've never seen a community that has any kind of complex problem where one approach is going to solve that problem 100% all the time. It just doesn't happen. And as part of the flood reform bill, one of the debates that happened was this concept of residual risk. So, if you have a levee, or if you live downstream of a dam, as the folks on the Missouri River Basin found out in 2011, you have risk there. It may not be high, and it may not be frequent from a probability perspective, but it could be catastrophic when it happens. And so things like having insurance in areas behind levees, that is a responsible thing to do, and that is something that's one of those multiple solution approaches. So there are risks in those areas, and I think as leaders in your communities, it's important to remember that again, there are multiple things that have to be done. In those same areas, and in New Orleans, I know really deals with this because of the protection level of the levees. I read a report recently that was talking about FEMA's mitigation programs, and it was talking about the structures that suffered the least damage, even in levee-protected areas, were the ones that were mitigated through the mitigation grant program because at least they were elevated a couple feet. So when you had that drainage that had to be drained and things like that, you at least didn't have the damage in those particular homes. So you still have things like mitigation and codes and standards that can be brought to bear. At the end of the day, as as communities and as local officials, the largest part of the burden in flood risk management falls on your shoulder, but it is a joint solution. The federal government has roles, certainly, with the Corps of Engineers and the expertise they have and the construction expertise, but they also have great technical assistance expertise, and they're expanding their role in that area a little bit. They have some small programs that can provide technical assistance to communities and states. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, when they're looking at some of the open space and easements in their conservation programs. FEMA, of course, with the disaster programs and the NFIP. So there are federal roles, but what is the realistic federal role going forward, given the budget constraints and those things? Now, I also think the states also have a role, and quite frankly, the states need to step it up a little bit. I remember ASFPM was formed by a group of Midwest states, where states were very strong. We didn't have the NFIP at that time or anything, and so the states had to figure out the problems, and they did. But we've seen because I think of budgets and issues where states have backtracked on that, and states also need to be helping communities and set state-level guidance and standards in working with communities. But again, at the local level, you're the one where that's where the rubber hits the roads. As Sandra said, you have the land use authority in control, and you can do a lot in that particular role. The freeboard standard, and one of the take-home points is when you look at the NFIP, look at it as a starting point. It is a minimum national standard, but there are some easy and low-cost type standards that you can use and have to reduce your risk. Freeboard, 3 feet of freeboard, it sounds like a lot, but when you think about the cost of construction, how much does it take to raise your foundation by a few rows of concrete block? From the cost of the insurance savings alone, those property owners are going to benefit. And then you as local officials aren't going to have to deal so much with the damage and all of the effects that causes. Subdivision standards. The NFIP doesn't get into that a whole lot. And I was actually a planning commissioner appointed by my county commissioners for the last 8 years. And we had some great subdivision standards that help flood loss reduction. So look at those as well. And then look at things like preserving areas of flood risk at open space. I've seen a lot of success stories, and it seems like communities are doing this, where your waterfront is an amenity. It can be a recreational amenity. It can be a natural amenity. Even in places where you have levees, like in Grand Forks, where they built setback levees, and so you have parks. They have some of the highest amount of parkland per capita in the country because they have parks all along their river, as well as using setback levees. So again, you can combine these types of things. So I want to, I just want to close with a couple thoughts, and that is, again, just understand that you have to use multiple solutions to deal with flood risk. A levee, your regs. Not one approach is going to solve those problems. The NFIPs are minimum standards. One of the things that we do at ASFPM is that we do provide handbooks and how-to guides and things like that for local officials. On your handout, there's cover photos of 2 of those. One of the initiatives we have is called No Adverse Impact. And I've got to say that from a elected official standpoint, a no adverse impact approach to floodplain management makes a lot of sense. It's basically the golden rule, or do no harm to your neighbor policy, and making sure that as floodplains and other areas in the communities are developed, they're developed responsibly. It's not a no development initiative, but it's a responsible development initiative. And the county commissioners that appointed me as a planning commissioner in my county, they understood it, and they were pro-growth and everything else, but they said, you know what, you're going to come in and develop in our community, you're going to be responsible for your actions, and you're not going to harm the people in our community. And that's a message that resonates, I think, to almost everybody. And so that you can have good floodplain management and do it in a no adverse impact way. And then finally, when you have that inevitable flood, and if you find yourself not fully prepared for it, Mayor Copeland, you were talking a lot about just, unless you've actually experienced it, it is really something that's, I think, a game changer. Take a little time to contemplate during that what's next moment, and bring the experts in if you need to. I have worked a lot of flood disasters in Ohio. There's always that inevitable council meeting, citizens meeting afterwards, and those things where you have people with torches and pitchforks, and they're angry, they're upset, they've been affected, their lives have been changed. And as the community, a lot of times communities can make very rash decisions at that time. The way that our federal programs and state programs work, a lot of times the state and federal resources are there. Demand that those folks be around at a table, spend some hours just talking about your strategy, because you can really pick their brains, you can incorporate that into your community goals, and you can plot a more resilient vision for your community's future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berginnis. Let's move next to Mr. Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Copeland. I do have a handout. If you work for the government, you always have to have a handout, right? So, keeping it with that standard, I am passing a handout around to all of you all. While that's being passed around, I would like to say thank you for inviting USDA to this conference. And I would like to say thank you to all the mayors in this room for volunteering your time to be a public servant, to serve your community, to take the time to come here and find out information that would betterment your communities and your people that you serve. So I'd like to say thank you from me, because your efforts and your time and your dedication to take your time out to come here and find out information that you can take back and serve your constituents is to be commended. So I want to thank you personally for that. What I'd like to do this morning is switch gears a little bit and talk about agriculture. And I've heard a lot of comments this morning about the floods. And yes, our agriculture industry had floods of 93 that devastated agriculture, 2011 along the Missouri River as well as the Mississippi River in several states had devastated communities. But we're going to focus in on agriculture as it relates to the 2012 drought and how it affects you and your communities and your constituents, and what USDA has in its tool chest that can help our farmers, which ultimately helps you as a mayor and your constituents in your communities. Agriculture involves all of us, from the food we eat to the clothes we wear to the chemicals we utilize for printing, for making commodities, and a lot of other things. So agriculture involves each and every one of us to some standard. What I would like to do this morning is focus in on what we are doing in USDA and what our farmers are doing and ranchers are doing to keep that supply of agriculture commodities to you and your communities. A few facts this morning that I'm going to go through as we go through the handouts is that we do have the greatest agriculture country in the world. One of our U.S. farmers and ranchers consistently produce and market the most abundant, the safest, the most economical for its citizens of any country in the world. Our farmers and ranchers continue to utilize the technology through GPS, global positioning systems, and their equipment. We have tractors and equipment in the United States that do not even need a driver through GPS technology. Through genetics and drought-resistant varieties of corn and soybeans and all the commodities that are planted, through the genetics, through production techniques, as well as planting and harvesting of our commodities and our livestock. While being the greatest conservationists of the world, our agriculture producers are saving soil and improving water quality through their techniques and their improvement of technology. I bring to you this morning an overview of a 2012 drought as it has affected the American agriculture industry, our communities, our economy, and consumer food prices. The Secretary of Agriculture has been a lead in all of the disaster activities in 2012, and we have over 1,800, close to 1,900 counties in the United States that has been declared Secretary designation for drought. And what that means is, I'll get into that in a little bit later, but that means emergency loans, it means some drought relief for livestock producers and crop producers. In some Midwestern states, this is the worst drought since 1988. If you look at some states, it's even worse than the Dust Bowls of the 1930s. However, there are some major differences between the 1930s, 1988, and 2012. Our farmers are resilient. Our farmers and ranchers in 2012, through innovations, through genetics, through technology, through crop diversity and commodity marketing, can and will absorb the conditions of a 2012 drought, as well as it did the 2011 flood and the 1993 flood that devastated so many agriculture acres in the United States. The drought of 2012 will have a far less impact on our consumer prices, on agriculture, and in your communities than did in the 1988s and for sure of the 1930s. I brought a handout with you, and it's in front of you, and I'm going to go through that. You can follow along if you'd like. I'm going to go through the slides and try to point out some information that is vital to agriculture and your communities. On page 1 there, the resilience of agriculture and innovation and diversity of growing crops can be shown through a 2012 drought, which was, as I said earlier, was one of the greatest droughts that we've had, but the economic input is minimal to our producers and to the consumer. First of all, what's the difference between 2012 agriculture farmers and ranchers and in 1988? Look at the farm economy. On page 1 there, the slide, our farm income has grown 147% since 1988. That's $98.1 billion in equity in 2011. Our U.S. agriculture farm debt to asset ratio has been cut by 50% since 1986. U.S. agriculture is responsible for 1 in 12 jobs in the United States. In many of your communities, I would venture to say that this number probably could go up to 4 to 5 jobs in your small communities along the river that agriculture brings into your community, from fertilizer sales to seed sales to truck sales to tractor sales to chemicals to wearing of jeans for cotton. All those things involve agriculture, and agriculture provides jobs in our communities. The big difference between the 1988 and 2012 is our crop insurance program that USDA administers and subsidizes through a private sector of crop insurance on page 2. Over 85% of our producers, ranchers in the United States have crop insurance. Now, what that means in crop insurance today is that our farmers and ranchers are paying an insurance premium to protect them against drought and floods for their commodities for yield purposes as well as revenue purposes. So our crop insurance policies have been expanded to 2012 to include revenue portions of our commodities. So in other words, a farmer can insure his corn crop for yield, so much a bushel per acre, as well as the amount of money that he gets for that crop that he would raise based on his insurance policy. 85% of all crop insurance claims in 2012 will be paid. We have multi-million-dollar operations out there that cannot afford not to have crop insurance for their operation. The basis for most crops in the United States is corn. It's sort of a setting guide sheet for corn, for beans, but corn is usually the staple crop in which all other crops are compared. It takes, in the United States, depending if you're in Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, it will take around average $600 per acre to put an acre of corn in the ground. That's a substantial expense for our producers in the United States. So this crop insurance is a vital part of that operation for our communities, because when the farm economy goes down, the communities go down. When communities go down, you're going to lose townships. So it's vital to us and you to maintain that agriculture industry in our communities. A little bit of a background there on page 2 also is I just want to show you, I'd like to have a show of hands. How many of you all have farmers markets in your community? If you would have looked back in 1970, we would have had a whole lot less hands. By 2011, we have 7,200 plus farmers markets in our communities. What does that do for you as a community leader? It involves smaller agriculture products or smaller agriculture industry, so that the average producer that has a farmer's market can sell his products from tomatoes to cucumbers to cantaloupe to watermelon to any other blueberries, strawberries, all the other commodities, has an option for those small community agriculture industries to come about for an increased agriculture industry. And I think that most of us would agree, I would much rather have a fresh tomato than a tomato out of a Hy-Vee store that has been transported about 2,000 miles in a refrigerated container. So marketing of commodities has been a tremendous increase by USDA, and we have encouraged producers, smaller producers, to get into these farmer markets throughout the United States, and by the show of hands, it seems to be working. The next page is page 3 there, farm exports. Our commodities in the United States is governed a large part by how many exports that we can get out to the other world. We have the greatest production of commodities in the world, and we have to be able to sell those commodities to other parts of the world so that our farmers can maintain their livelihood. A couple of years ago, probably, I've been with the agency for about 34 years. When I first started, the average percentage of farmers in the United States per population was around 3%. We are looking at about 1 to 1.5% of the population are farmers, actually farmers in the United States in 2012. For farm exports, you have noticed in 2011 we have increased exports from 1988 from $37 billion in exports to $137 billion. That has helped our farmers, that has helped the market prices that farmers receive due to this export increase, because we do have and continue to have an ag surplus in the United States on the production of our commodities in the United States. The next chart there just shows you our staple crop, which is corn, and all crops are compared to corn when you look at this. I just want to point out that if you want to look at that chart sometime other, I just want to point out the yields. For the estimated yields for 2011 and 2012 is going to run about 147 bushel. For 2012-13, the estimate is 123 bushel. That's a decrease of about 14 to 15% in a yield production due to the drought of 2012. What does that tell you? That we're still producing crops in the United States through genetics, through our technology, that even we can still take a drought and take it on the chin through our diversity of our agriculture and still produce a crop that's needed in the world and in the United States. The average price for corn, if you notice in 2011 and 12, down at the very bottom of that chart, running between $6.26 and $6.30. The corn price 2013, 2012 runs about $7.50 to $8.90. Corn prices at the local markets and at harvest time this year is running around $8 a bushel. So what does that mean for our producers? You can figure it out at $8 a bushel and 100 bushels. It's roughly about $800 an acre. That farmer took $600 of his income, so he's making, luckily, and that doesn't include his labor, and it doesn't include the farm payment. So he's still close to breaking even. So our commodities continue to be a stumbling block for our farmers, but we want to remember when you look at your constituents, when you look at the United States, when you look at commodity prices, you want to reflect not on the price of commodities, but the price of consumer products. One gets that confused sometimes in agriculture, and it gives a negative spin on our producers and what they receive for their commodities. A consumer price is not a commodity price. Commodity prices are not consumer prices. That may reflect on down the road, but it's not a correlation. If you get a 50% increase in your commodity price, doesn't mean that you'll have a 50% increase at the farmer's consumer price at the grocery store. And I'll show you that in just a few minutes. You cannot talk about corn in agriculture unless you talk about biofuels. The biofuel industry on page 4 there has increased from 837 million gallons of ethanol production in 1988 through 2012. What does that do to our communities? I don't know how many of you all have an ethanol production facility in your area. The state of Missouri has about 4 of those ethanol productions and about 3 soybean diesel plants cooking throughout the through Missouri. What does that do for our economy? It employs, there's about 3,000 American companies that is working with our ethanol and renewable resources in the United States. 25,000 of those bio-based products made are renewable resources. That means we can continue to make them on a yearly basis. This innovation has created over 100,000 jobs in the ethanol industry. So our backing of that has increased the livelihood of agriculture communities by bringing in additional jobs. What has that done, excuse me, for the average consumer that's buying gasoline? If you notice on that chart there, it has saved Americans about $1.09 per gallon in 2011 that you would have had to pay if you didn't have ethanol out there as a mix in gasoline. The production in agriculture on page 5 there, I just threw this out as just to give you an idea how well our farmers are producing in through the crops that we have, that we produce in the United States. There's only 4 crops listed there, livestock products as well. But every crop in the United States has increased in productivity. Just notice there, in soybeans, we've increased our production of soybeans by over 30%. Corn, 38%. Red meat and poultry, 46%. And our milk production in the United States has increased by 57%. That's a lot of chocolate milk. We have increased our production in milk production by 57% since 1987. That is a lot of milk products being produced by our dairy industry. The corn conditions in 2012, it's a chart there. It just gives you an idea of the comparison between 1988 and 2012 versus the 2011 year. Our condition of our crops is less than they were in 2012. Condition of the crop, again, is not how many bushels we have, but the severity of the drought. In other words, when we in USDA say that we have a 40% damage to our crop, that's a 40% of the yield, but that could be expected from that farm. The average yield in corn in Missouri would run about 150 to 110 bushel per acre now, where in 1980, 1970, our average yields were running probably 60 to 90 bushels. So when we have a 40% reduction in our losses, when we call a loss of our crop, you need to be looking at that percentage based on our yields in the state, in the United States, not just the production of it in itself. What are we doing in USDA? On the next slide there, or next PowerPoint presentation, I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm sorry, it's just a handout. But what have we done in USDA? Our Secretary of Agriculture has pulled out his toolbox, and we have utilized every tool that we have in that toolbox. Depending on what Congress does with the Farm Bill and what they do with emergency legislation will depend on what USDA will do in addition to what we have in our toolbox at this point in time. What have we done? We have released our conservation reserve acres, our acres that has been maintained to save soil and water conservation for livestock feed. We have released those acres for haying and grazing. The Secretary released not only our regular haying and grazing acres, our continuous haying and grazing, which are more restrictive on our wetland reserve programs and our conservation reserve programs. We have released those acres for haying and grazing. What that does, it allows our livestock producers to have a resource for feedstuffs for their livestock in the winter months. We have lowered the reduction for haying and grazing for our farmers from 25% to 10%. I said as a secretary designation in those 1,900 counties that have been declared disaster, we are offering through USDA emergency loans. What that means is we have an emergency loan program that has, and Secretary has reduced the interest rate from 3.75% down to 2.25% for our farmers and ranchers for emergency loans based on their losses for 2012 due to the drought and our flood conditions. We have encouraged our crop insurance private industry to extend the premium rate times in which farmers have to pay for their premiums for crop insurance to the end of November, which is a 30-day grace period for our producers, hoping that they will have the commodities harvested by then so that they can pay their premiums. We have allocated over $14 million and intend to do additional millions of dollars for our programs in drought under the Emergency Conservation Program, in which we are digging wells for livestock producers. We are hooking onto rural water. We are digging and cleaning out ponds. We are providing livestock feed to our producers through the Emergency Conservation Program. The NRCS office has been authorized to enhance their EQIP program, which is a program in which allows producers to have long-term contracts on their farms through water conservation and pasture rotation. They have increased that amount of money to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, part of USDA, to help our producers get through this time of drought. The USDA has purchased over $170 million worth in commodities that do not have a farm program attached to them, which is pork, lamb, chicken, and catfish. That commodity will help the surplus, which will help prices for those farmers. That surplus information or surplus commodities went into our nutritional programs, which is school lunch programs, as well as our food stamp program. We allowed cover crops to be established for our livestock producers that would not normally be utilized on crops for crop insurance purposes. Other agencies in the administration that have had an effect on agriculture in 2012 at our SBA or Small Business Administration, they are conducting outreach efforts. They may have been conducting some outreach efforts even in your community to authorize small business loans affected, small business in your community that have been affected by drought would be eligible for some Small Business Administration emergency loan programs. Our National Credit Union Administration has issued and has authorized an additional 1,000 credit unions the capacity to increase their credit limit to 12.5% of their normal withholdings for funding. What that will do is open up additional funding for small businesses through the Credit Union of the United States. I've heard several reports on the Army Corps of Engineers. If we do not have the Mississippi River, we will not be able to import and export our commodities, our chemicals, our seed, our fertilizer that we can run this country with. So we would like to say thanks to the Corps of Engineers, of keeping those lanes open because of the drought that reduced the water flow in the Mississippi, got to the point of critical mass in which we were not going to be able to transport our commodities that is being harvested this year down to the Gulf so that we could export those commodities. Very, very important for us for the Mississippi. Department of Transportation. I was on a call about a week ago with the Department of Transportation is working with governors of states to reduce the paperwork, reduce the number of requirements for the ag industry from the width of items going down the road, because we are, if you haven't seen bales of hay going down the road on interstates this year, you will see them, because we are moving hay all over the United States because of drought and livestock producers. What we have done in the U.S. government is allowed that width requirement to be extended for agriculture commodities and those truck drivers. We have also increased allowing the weight limits of those trucks for agriculture commodities to get those commodities to market on the truck drivers, as well as the license for those persons driving those trucks to get those ag commodities to the market. So they have reduced those restrictions, allowing a little bit more leeway to get those commodities to the marketplace. What has the agriculture done, USDA done for the food prices? Most of us go to the grocery market every day. We do not look at what's available. In America, we have plenty of crops, plenty of food availability. What do we do in spendable income is compared to other parts of the world? The chart there shows that the average income in the United States is around $32,851. I just threw one country into this mix. We can throw many countries into it, but we all know that the United States, the average income is around $32,851. If I compare that with France, which average income, excuse me, is around $24,000, look at the percent of income that they have to spend for food products in France, which is 13.2%, where versus United States, we spend only 6.4% of our disposable income for the food that we eat for our families. What does that transpire to? As far as what the farmers, you know, one of the things that I fight with is people think that our farmers are getting wealthy because corn prices go up to $8. Our commodities at the grocery store, our farmers take home about 14 cents of every dollar that is spent at the supermarket. The rest of it is somewhere else. So our agriculture is a pretty good industry. We are continuing in its resilience to supply food that is economic significance to our constituents and to you. What do we expect food prices to do in 2012 due to the drought? Average consumer index pricing of inflation is about 3% a year on food prices. We expect, due to the drought conditions, that to be around 4 to 4.5% for 2012 as far as food prices are concerned. A slight increase of about 1 to 1.5%. So, as far as the drought's concerned for 2012, it was a bad situation. It was bad for our producers, but our American farmers and ranchers are very resilient. One thing that I didn't mention, and I think I skipped over, was our livestock industry. Of our livestock industry, that's probably the industry that has been hurt the worst in the United States due to the fact we have very few programs that we can help our ranchers with. We are hoping that Congress passes some type of farm bill this month. They've only got about 6 or 7 days left, but we're still hopeful that they will either extend the farm bill or initiate some programs for our livestock industry. If you have any concerns about the dairy industry, that is our major concern. In the state of Missouri, we started out in Missouri in August of 2011 with about 1,100 to 1,200 dairy operations in the state of Missouri. We have lost 93 dairy operations in 2012. 63 of them dairy operations have been a direct result of the drought of 2012. Why? Because the milk prices are low, there's no feed, we have no water, and commodity prices to feed those animals are substantially higher. So what's going to happen, most of those dairy operations are taking those livestock to market, and that livestock is not going back to the farm. 75 to 80% of all those livestock dairy animals is going to slaughter, which means that our dairy industry is going further and further down unless we have some type of programs initiated by Congress to help our dairy producers. It is a very, very serious problem for the dairy industry. With that, I'll be available. I guess we're going to have some questions, Mr. Copeland, but I do appreciate the time that you have given me to explain USDA's drought assistance program for 2012. Thank you.
Frank, we're limited for time so we can stay on schedule, but we're going to open the floor up for any questions from the mayor. If we have time, we'll accept questions from the gallery. And we'll start off with anyone who has any questions for any of our speakers. And please, would you mind announcing who you are, who you're with?
St. Cloud, Mayor of St. Cloud, Minnesota, Dr. Knight, question for you. Question, or love your analogy with your brother. Are there statistics as to how many people that should be insured don't have insurance? One of the things I know, as you mentioned, it's very difficult to get people to think of doing insurance because they always, there's a misconception that FEMA's going to come in and spend all this money, the state's going to fill in the rest of the gap, and then if there's anything locally, we fill in the rest. But is there any statistics as to how many people who should, and how do you get that message out?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, and I may reach to my lifeline. Chad probably's got the numbers better than I because they watch that. But first of all, insurance is not mandatory unless you have a federally backed loan and you're in the special flood hazard area, which is this 1% annual flood. That is implemented not through FEMA, but through the lenders. So the lenders enforce homeowner participation if they have federally backed loans. There isn't, so that means those that don't have federally backed loans, and quite frankly in the Midwest, a lot of people own their homes outright. So the penetration there is a lot lower than it should be. I've heard numbers like 25% penetration. I don't know if I have one of my staff members back here, if anybody has better numbers than that. Do you have a better number, Chad?
I think that's similar. I think you're right for the Midwest, but it varies substantially by region. The South has a lot higher than that, but I think that's.
Yeah, so in some states, it's people really, the penetration's a lot deeper. You know, Texas, Florida, places, there's a lot of communities where the insurance homeowners buy it and adhere to it, but then there's places where it's low. And in spite of our campaigns, you've probably seen them on the news, Flood Smart, we're really working to step that up and get people's attention to make sure they do have homeowners insurance or flood insurance as well as homeowners. And so that's a place where I think you as community officials can help. One of the statistics I didn't say was that even though 68% of the local officials know their communities are at risk, only 30% are communicating that to their communities. And so helping get folks to buy the insurance that's available to them would be most helpful. But it's low. It's lower than it should be.
AC Board Mayor of Memphis, Tennessee. At a policy level, what is the message that we as mayors ought to send to the developers and residents and individuals who are just crying to get back and build on the river? I know in our case, our downtown population is probably one of the largest. We have over 20,000 people, many of whom are wanting to build on the river. Without getting down into the weeds on it, what do we as mayors say? Do we say, yes, keep on coming? Or do we say, don't go in that zone? Or do we say, go but get insurance? See, mayors don't usually get out into making
Yeah, but
Our broad policy.
yeah, but you do help make that decision in terms of the zoning laws and the standards for building codes. And I think, it's not to say you can't build back, but I think the do no harm philosophy that Chad was talking about is what you need to consider. You don't want to, I know you have a beautiful community out on Harbor Town and that sort of thing. Building to a certain level of standard ensures that that community will be there after the next flood and will be, so for developers that aren't thinking the long term, it's up to the community officials to make sure that they build the code.
I'd like to touch on that from a real brief story. Sometimes we learn by the mistakes of others. My predecessor experienced a flood in Vicksburg, I would say back in '08. And he didn't articulate, I think, to a lot of the residents who were flooded. During 2011, Vicksburg was the largest concentration of residential flooding in the 11 flood. And in that area is high African American, fixed income, or low income. So a lot of the people couldn't afford to move out. It wasn't that they didn't want to, they just, they were elderly and whatnot. And I knew from some of the incidents that had happened in other natural disasters that we just need to communicate with them early and often, but also make sure that we remind them that they have to stay in compliance with the National Flood Plan, because if not, everybody in our county is jeopardized. And so I didn't throw it off on the feds, because the other guy tried to do that, and then they turned it on him because there was a rumor that the city wanted to buy all the land and put them out and take their property, because people have all kinds of ideas that get floated. But we communicated with them that the city and the state and the feds have continued to put the money in, and we have these repetitive losses. And so they've got to move to higher ground because the money's not going to be there anymore. And so it's a real tough situation. And I've had some discussion with people from FEMA about other plans to move people to higher ground and to mitigate the repetitive losses that keep occurring. In the area I'm talking about is the Kings community in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is the closest thing to the Mississippi Delta that we can have people in trailers. It's not the typical type construction that we have in an old city like Vicksburg, because Mayor Walker had annexed that area, and there were other infrastructure needs that were still in need. But it can be a nightmare for a mayor being flooded in an area like that. And by the grace of God, we were able to shepherd the people through it and move them to other parts of town without having all the problems and pushing it back on the residents to make the smart decisions. But it can be a nightmare for you if it's not negotiated properly, that we don't need to keep moving back in here.
I think three key short messages are important. The first, and sometimes the media is not helpful in this way, and that is we have flood risk, and this is a repetitive problem. And that's hard, and especially in a community that's maybe only flooded once in most people's memories. Doesn't mean the next flood can't happen the following week, but you've got to convince folks that there is a problem there. Those flood risk zones are designated, they aren't going away, and they are susceptible starting the next day for the next flood. So that's the first. The second is that we've got to come back more resilient, so we're decreasing the cost and impact on the community and the taxpayers. And then the third, and actually the third is more what not to do. In the heat of the moment, don't relax the redevelopment standards and those kinds of things, because, and Mayor Winfield's comment is spot on this. It's not just about the NFIP. At the end of the day, a house that's rebuilt lower than the flood elevation, those citizens are going to be paying higher premiums until the day that that house is moved or destroyed, because they're at higher risk. And that's the bottom line. It's impacting by waiving those things. And I've talked to a lot of communities off that ledge after a flood. And council's like, hey, we're ready to waive the standards to make sure people can rebuild as fast as possible. And from a mayor's standpoint, the leadership is like, let's rebuild quick, but let's do it smartly. And so those, I think, are some of the key messages.
Excuse me, Tom Hayes from Old. This is for Mr. Grant. I spent 40 years in the grocery business and see what commodities do for the price of the grocery to the consumer. With the drought this summer, who or does anyone make the determination whether more of that corn is allocated away from ethanol products or to hold and stabilize the grocery prices that are, we all need on a daily basis?
Sure. The debate on agriculture and use of corn for ethanol production is a debate. The administration has, and it depends on which study you see, overall the effect of prices of that commodity. We want to realize that, and I said earlier, the commodity prices versus consumer prices is a difference. The commodity prices that would be reflected if we did away with the ethanol subsidy that ethanol producers are receiving now would reflect from $0 to about $1, $1.50 in commodity prices, which would bring that corn price down from $8 to $6.50, $7. So that commodity price reflection, according to our study, it does not reflect that great of a reduction in food prices as much as the middle ground from 14 cents of every dollar to going up to 15 cents a dollar. The increase in inflation that we're projecting at 1.5%, it does take into account the continuation of that ethanol production. So, it's a debate there, but our studies seem to think that the overall benefit of continuing our ethanol production through the employment of over 100,000 jobs in the communities overrides the small increase in food prices.
Anyone else? I got a quick question. Are you familiar with the St. Francis Levy District?
Yes, I am.
Who is?
My son has family from Osceola, just as a heads up.
We'll talk about that later. I agree with everything that both you and Chet said about being prepared, zoning, raising. But as the mayor of Vicksburg, we have a large minority, but we also have a large displaced farm people in our poor people. They don't buy or live in new houses. 150-year-old houses, we have a lot of those that we can't be renovated. These people are poor, and they don't have, weekend football money to put on their flood insurance.
I
They can't
understand
afford
that.
flood
Yeah,
insurance
yeah.
money either. Or we sit on the Niagara Falls, and I know Mayor Warren's got is affected by this. And all these meetings that we went to with both your agencies on both of these issues, flood, number one, we've been taxing ourselves. We've been buying insurance since 1917, paying levy taxes.
Right.
And our levy held this last 500-year flood this last year, period, proved itself. Heretofore, the flood insurance rates, I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but there is a risk. But you guys set a high, y'all made our floodplain in the St. Francis levy district higher than a lot of places that have little bitty levies, private levies. And we continue to pay taxes to maintain that levy. Now, again, I'm not saying forget all this. I'm talking about the rate of flood insurance that you charge, that you set. It's like we're more likely to have a flood than anybody else. And our Niagara Falls, our earthquake insurance, you have us rated that we are more likely to have a earthquake than the Santa Andreas fault, according to what I've been told about our earthquake rates. I have earthquake on my house, and I have some That's not problem. I've got earthquake insurance. I'm talking about the rates now.
Yeah, we don't sell earthquake insurance.
Well, you get, why
Yeah.
we feel, you talk about those pitchforks that the citizens will get after, a lot of them don't want insurance, but
Yeah.
those who want it don't get after us because you need to find out, Mayor, you need to make these people get this rate down.
Yeah.
I'm talking to these people
Yeah.
now.
I think we've all heard that.
Why are our rates up so high?
I can answer some of the questions. First of all, the USGS puts out the earthquake hazard maps, and they're very accurate, and the New Madrid fault is a large fault. That's why we had a national level exercise on catastrophic events that can occur from that. And you are right, your area is in a high hazard area for earthquakes. If you can get, but the federal government doesn't sell earthquake insurance, so I'm only in the flood insurance business. St. Francis River levee. I have had many meetings with Rob Rash and the whole team there, and so I'm very familiar with it. As you know, and kudos to the St. Francis Levee District because they have maintained their levee. When you look at a levee, you look at a system. So if it's only as good as its weakest link, right? It's a bathtub. So if there's any low spot, you're subject to, but potential inundation. And yes, the levee's held. And after, after the 2011 floods, the Corps of Engineers did an excellent job managing the whole system. But there were damages. So anytime you continue to exercise that system, you're going to come back in, you're going to have to do repairs. So we know that. And it's hard, and it costs money to do that, and that's why you have to keep taxing your levee district to keep those repairs up. And so every flood weakens the system unless you can go back and build it back. So yes, there's a risk behind the levees. If you are behind a levee that has 1% or better protection, you are in what's called an X zone, which means you're outside of the 100-year floodplain, and you get the low-cost insurance. And the low-cost insurance is from anywhere from $125 up to $400, depending on the value of your home and what the contents that you insure per year. So that's actually pretty low, given that you could have a catastrophic overtopping or weakening of the levee system. We know levees can fail, just like dams can fail. And so there is a chance that it can happen. It's not mandatory unless they have a federally backed loan. But when we do the flood risk assessments, we not only look at what the levee's protecting, but we also look at what the interior flooding looks like. And so I know from the May 2010 floods that came over eastern Arkansas and on into Nashville, and many 100-year levees were overtopped in Nashville. That atmospheric river that hovered over eastern Arkansas and West Tennessee, it dropped enough rain that many people behind levees flooded, just as we're seeing from the hurricane in the last few weeks, Isaac, that there's a lot of interior flooding that goes on. So even if you're protected by levees, you also have to look at the other risk of flooding from living in a bathtub, basically. It can pond behind it. I will tell you this, and many of you know this. I got, representing the flood insurance program and the FEMA, we got a letter from 29 senators and 49 congressional members asking us to reevaluate how we map levees in our flood risk program. And we, considering the things that you're saying, we had rather black and white view of it, very binary. Either your levee passed the 1% accreditation or it didn't, and we looked at the whole potential floodplain. Now we're looking at a process when we brought in all kinds of academics and partners to help build a new mapping process so that we can look at where it could break. Do you have freeboard? What is the potential, real potential risk you have behind that levee, and trying to do a better job of just black and white, you're in or you're out, in terms of the levee being accredited. So that process put all levee mapping that was up for renewal, which was about 230 projects, on hold until we can get the new procedures out, which we will be rolling out in the next year. So I've had a lot of conversations with your team down there, and so I do appreciate that. And it is hard to say for communities that can't afford. And some of the things we've looked at as we've talked about reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, and it not all reflected in this new bill. And thank goodness we got a 5-year reauthorization. But some of the things we talked about is there's an actuarial need to have charge those that can afford the rate that's appropriate to their risk. But there's a vulnerable part of our community that can't afford. And so how do we deal with that? And that's not set up under the laws that the Flood Insurance Act was set up under. And so it's going to take some legislative changes, I think, to address that issue.
There's no doubt in our part of the country that the county, we the city passed the ordinance you're talking about, to get flood insurance. But Mississippi County Court actually had a big fight, and the majority of them voted not to pass the thing because they didn't want the federal government coming in and setting our rates and telling us that they did eventually.
I think they did eventually. I had an interesting meeting there. They did eventually, yes.
Inform your citizens. Sometimes I think ours has too much information. They want to tell us what we ought to tell you guys.
Can I just add just one quick thing on the flood insurance reform? Again, I mentioned one of the things on the reform bill that the Congress did is that we're going to see some pretty significant rate increases. And one of the things that was dropped out of the reform bill that I know FEMA and other entities were hoping are some studies and then some actions dealing with the affordability. You know, the issue you brought up, there's a lot of folks, a lot of poor folks in our floodplains that they don't have the money to deal with flood insurance and those kinds of things. One of the things I've been predicting, I've been talking to our chapter meetings last couple weeks of some of our chapters. I think we're going to see a push to do some kind of mini reform in the next few years to deal squarely with this affordability issue. You all are going to hear this first in terms of citizens complaining and things like that. There are some interesting ideas that are out there. There's a piece of legislation. It's a study, but it passed I think it passed the House earlier this week, and it's going for the Senate for consideration. It's a study on affordability and looking at innovative options like group flood insurance. One of the things that FEMA can't do or doesn't do now, and I don't is could a community or a levee district buy a policy for everybody behind the levee, and you get a lower cost overall, and then through your taxing authority, the premium can be paid and things like that. Some innovative ways to look at how to make the policies more affordable. That's going to be huge. It was not in the reform bill other than one study, and it's something that as mayors really need to let your delegations, I think, know that they need to look into it and get some options available.
Let's close with that so we can stay on schedule. First of all, isn't it unbelievable? Almost 2 hours in this discussion, so it's very informative. But I'd like to close in saying that, as each of you are aware, this meeting is to equip mayors along the Mississippi River with the knowledge base necessary to establish a platform for the waterway we plan to unveil in Washington this coming spring. I think each of you has done much to add to our understanding of floodplain development and disaster response. We thank you for all your input, and we hope we can continue to work with you as we move towards a unified management plan for the river. We're going to take about, it was 15, it will take about 5 minutes, and so the mayors would be back in 5 minutes, and Mayor Hostess would conduct our next discussion. Thank you very much.